Hello and welcome to this GAD webinar. I'm Heidi Stancliffe, Editor-in-Chief for GAD, and I'm joined here today by Professor Rigas Daganis, Chairman of the European Aviation Club. We'll also be live tweeting this webinar, so you can join in the conversation using the hashtag GADWebinar. With the government decision on airport capacity in favour of Heathrow made just last week, today's discussion will focus on what happens next and the future for growth and investment in the London airport system. Today, I'm joined on the line by Nigel Milton, Director of External Affairs for Heathrow Airport, Stephen Costello, Director of Heathrow Hub, and James Halstead, Partner at Aviation Strategies. Gatwick Airports were also invited to participate in today's webinar, but nobody was available. Before I hand over to Rigas, I'd like to remind you to send in your questions for the panel, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible. If you have any questions at any point, you can send them to us using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. Rigas, over to you.
Thank you, Heidi, and good afternoon, everybody. Clearly, the decision taken by the government 2 weeks ago didn't come as a complete surprise. There'd been lots of leaks suggesting it would be Heathrow, a third runway. The government has taken the decision, but it seems it's not an immediate decision. There seem to be a number of hurdles, and I wonder, Nigel, if you could just talk us through what hurdles remain as you see them.
Yes, thank you, Rigas, and good afternoon, everybody. I think we don't really see them as hurdles so much as just the process, the legitimate process that needs to be gone through before the third runway can be constructed. The law on this in the UK is very clear under the Planning Act that the government needs to issue and Parliament needs to vote on a national policy statement. That will be consulted on next year before it is then put to the House of Commons next autumn and voted on then. At that point, we will then apply for the planning permission, and that process will take a number of years.
What does national policy statement mean?
That means basically the government sets out the rationale for why a third runway at Heathrow is needed and what they expect that third runway at Heathrow to provide for the country. So basically it sets out the terms and conditions under which Heathrow will be given, has the permission to build and then operate a third runway.
Right, go on, the next hurdle.
And then after that, then that national policy statement then sets the framework under which we can apply for planning permission, which we'll do at the end of next year, and then that process will go through the minutiae and the detail of how is that, of where all of the supporting infrastructure would go, what the mitigation needs to be. That process will take 2 years, and then at the end of 2019, end of 2020, the planning inspector will make a recommendation to government, which, assuming that that is compliant with the national policy statement, the government will then approve, and construction can then begin in 2020.
Chris Grayling, the Transport Secretary, in making the statement, said that you'll be able to bring forward a planning application safe in the knowledge, and I quote, safe in the knowledge that the high-level arguments will have been settled and will not be reopened. If that is the case, what's the purpose of the consultation?
Of the consultation that happens next year is that the consultation is on the draft national policy statement. So the high-level arguments and justification that the Secretary of State referred to in his speech, those arguments and justification are set out in the draft national policy statement, which the government will publish at the beginning of next year, and they will be consulting on that before they issue their final national policy statement next autumn.
And we hear that people are going, even now, make legal challenges regarding the government decision. What challenges are likely, and how do you face up to them?
Well, the challenges are on the judicial review is against the government rather than against Heathrow. It's a challenge to the decision that the government has taken and will be taking. But we, like the government, are confident that any judicial review would be unsuccessful, and we also remain very confident that it wouldn't affect the timeline of delivery. But as to what the actual subject matter of the judicial reviews will be, I think we've already seen publications by local authorities and environmental residence groups that they will be challenging the bias of the Airports Commission, the air quality issues, the need for additional capacity. So I think we can expect to see judicial reviews on most aspects of of the rationale behind the decision. And I think that one of the frustrations that we've all had is how long this process has taken through the Airports Commission process, through government considering the Airports Commission's recommendations and then making the announcement it made last week. But what the big advantage of that timeline has been that the government is very confident in the legal process that it's undertaken and therefore its ability to successfully withstand any judicial review.
You mentioned environment. The government has required you to ensure that air quality and pollution levels are kept within national and international standards. You don't generate the pollution or the noise yourselves. How do you ensure that the standards are met?
Because we do have, although you're right, Regis, that we aren't responsible for all of it. We are. We do have leverage and influence to encourage airlines to fly quieter aircraft and to fly them in using quieter procedures. And we also have levers to encourage more staff and more passengers to access the airport using more sustainable forms of transport. So what we need to do is leverage those as much as we possibly can.
Clearly, an aspect of the pollution is the surface access. What are your plans for surface access, and how far are they dependent on people outside the Heathrow Limited making investments?
Our plans are a really comprehensive part of and quite a significant part of the overall plan, because we are clear that Heathrow Expansion needs to go ahead with no additional traffic being generated on the roads around Heathrow. So if you're going to increase the number of passengers by 50%, increase the number of staff working at the airport by 20 or 30%, then you're going to have to significantly increase the capability of people to get to the airport using sustainable transport. So we are planning to build on our already investment in local bus routes, subsidising those to make them 24 hours and serving new destinations around the airport. We've got Crossrail coming in 2019, which is a new route into central London. An upgrade to the Piccadilly line, which is the tube network into London, is coming. And then high-speed rail is HS2 is coming into the vicinity of the airport in about a decade's time, and there'll be a link to the station, the station that's going to be nearest to Heathrow for that. But the two main new rail links, one to the west and one to the south, which the one to the west is already well progressed. Network Rail have already consulted on the route and are now starting some of the initial work on that one. And then the route to the south, or the rail route to the south, that has preliminary work on options is underway at the moment. So when all those are finished, Heathrow will have a significant increase in the capability or to be able to access the airport by road and rail. And in terms of financing those, several of them are already financed and are happening, but as is the case with all surface access to airports in the UK, we will pay our fair share, contributing towards the cost of those projects to the extent to which airport users benefit from them.
The cost is an interesting issue, isn't it? Because you've recently agreed, under pressure, I think, you've given a commitment to keep airport charges at their current levels. You didn't do that in your original submission to the Davis Commission. What has happened which now enables you to suddenly make this commitment?
It's always been our intention to keep the charge, to ensure that the charges were affordable to passengers and airlines. And what we are doing, Regis, is optimising our plans to rephase certain pieces of work and look at what is required and when, to ensure that we deliver as cost efficiently as possible. Ultimately, it'd be down to the regulator to ensure that our prices are fair, but we are definitely committed to ensuring that our charges are as low as they can be.
Perhaps I can bring Steve in here. Your proposal was for the hub, basically involving an extension of the northerly runway.
That's right, yes.
Pardon?
Sorry, I was just saying that's right, yeah.
Yeah. What advantages would that have had over the third runway, which Nigel's been talking about?
So we started really from a different place. I suppose I should first of all say that we very much welcome the decision that it's Heathrow. We think that is the right choice for the UK. I suppose in an ideal world we would say that you would have much more freedom to let the market decide where capacity should be, but we are where we are. And if we're going to be limited to one new runway, it should be Heathrow. But our starting point was to say that as a country, we've been round the loop with Heathrow Expansion a number of times. And our starting point was twofold. One was to say that no new people need be brought into the noise footprint, so hence you maintain the runway centre lines. And secondly, that you try to minimise the capital cost in two ways. One, by taking as little land as possible and making sure that what land you do take isn't occupied by very high value infrastructure or facilities that are perhaps challenging to move. And secondly, by designing in from the start the ability to phase. So our phase one was designed to deliver about 70,000 more movements, so that would mean that you don't have to increase terminal capacity. The terminals can cope up to about 95 million passengers a year, and put in the runway, the taxiways, and the first slug of satellites. So that was below 4 billion in capital cost, including diverting the M25. So that meant that we could with confidence say that there was a fundable scheme there that kept aero charges at today's levels. They were the principal objectives of our scheme.
But your scheme was turned down. Can you just summarise for us what the key shortcomings of your scheme as seen by the Davies Commission were? So the Davies Commission, we scored better in terms of cost and local impact, but we scored worse on the Commission's findings on noise and, among other things, capacity. For some reason that we still struggle to understand, they said that although we create 3 runways capable of independent operations, exactly the same as Hal's plans, we could only deliver 700,000 movements a year, and Hal's scheme could deliver 740. And that seems to have carried through to the government's own analysis over the year since the Commission reported. But when, I suppose in direct answer to your question, when the Secretary of State was directly asked the question in the House of Commons after he made his statement last week, he said there were 2 issues. One was respite, that we couldn't match Heathrow's plans for respite. And secondly, and perhaps more controversially, he said, well, we didn't own the airport, so we couldn't guarantee that we would be able to deliver the scheme. So I think on that one we feel, well, it would have been helpful to have known that sort of 5 years ago when the whole process started. It could have saved us all a lot of time and money. But it seems to have come down in the DFT's analysis published last week to capacity. They still seem to say that we can't match the same capacity, therefore the economic benefits are lower, and the issue that we don't own the airport. The economic benefits is a key difference between your 2 schemes. Talking of economic benefits, there was a rumour last week, or perhaps earlier this week, that the economic benefits of Heathrow had been overstated. Nigel, I imagine you'll deny that's the case, but where did that rumour come from? That leak?
Well, it's not a rumour. It's the nature of economic forecasting, Regis, and you can use different models and come up with different answers. What's clear is that under whatever model was used and whatever assumptions are fed into the model, whether that be the government's model or the Airports Commission's model, under every scenario, the economic benefits of Heathrow are greater than the economic benefits of Heathrow Hub or of Gatwick. That was the clear conclusion. The specifics that you mentioned is that in the model that governments use, which is the Treasury Green Book model, which looks at direct economic benefits, that came to a number of the Heathrow expansion would bring economic benefits of 61 billion, and the Airports Commission, which used a benefit to GDP and used a different way of modelling, which included things like the value of inbound tourism, the value of exports and of foreign direct investment. So we would argue a far more comprehensive model, which therefore gave a much bigger number, and therefore that's the difference between between the two numbers. What isn't in doubt and what hasn't been questioned, Regis, is that Heathrow expansion is, as far as the economy is concerned, is the best option that was being considered by the Airports Commission and then by the government.
James, you're an economist. What is your assessment of the economic benefits of the alternative schemes? And while you're thinking of the answer to that, perhaps I could urge listeners to send in more questions so we can get your views or your questions answered. James, the economic benefits.
I pick up on the earlier comment. I mean, the economic forecasts, like any economic forecast, it depends what assumptions you make as to what answer you get out. The point being that if you have the capacity, you will get better economic benefits if you don't have the capacity. And whether we pick a number of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 or 60, it doesn't really matter. The real problem is that we'd be constrained on capacity in the southeast, and the exceptional problem is be constrained on capacity at Heathrow. So any expansion will be beneficial. I like both projects. I particularly like the extended runway project, but that was not decided. It's a shame, really. It was innovative, and it probably meant that fewer houses are going to be destroyed. But sort of where we decide on the economic benefits just for one single runway, it is a real shame in this process that we couldn't actually, as Michael O'Leary has recently said, given the option to each of the three airports, the three main airports in London, to make a commercial decision as to whether a runway should be built.
I agree. Could I just come in? Because we do seem to have got the worst of all worlds, really, in that the airports are all privately owned, privately invested assets, private airlines operating out of them, and yet we have this very high level of political, I was going to use the word interference. Obviously there is a need for political engagement, but we've ended up in the worst of all possible worlds, and I think we exacerbate that by our lack of any integrated transport policy. I mean, I entirely support Heathrow's proposals for better rail access. I think that's absolutely key, and perhaps we should emphasise that it's a government condition of expansion that it gets the public transport mode share up to 55%. But it's very difficult because of the fragmented nature of planning. I mean, there is only so much within Hal's gift there. And as Chris Grayling said when he stood up as Secretary of State after the announcement, he has no idea as to what schemes are included or needed or desirable. And that seems a very different approach to the one that we see happening so successfully at Schiphol, Charles de Gaulle and Frankfurt. So, it's a challenge, and perhaps I can say something that perhaps Nigel can't, which is that Hal are in a very difficult situation in trying to square the circle. A private infrastructure investor and asset owner constrained on their aero charges, whichever way you cut it, a very challenging high-cost scheme to deliver with some very serious conditions placed on it. So, I think as a country, we could actually take take a different approach to this in terms of saying that there are some assets which just need a much more strategic approach, which cuts across the public-private divide.
Talking of the issues you've just raised, would the better strategy have been to have two runways, one at Gatwick and one at Heathrow? After all, 7 or 8 years ago, a huge Department of Transport inquiry under the Labour government into the airport capacity in the southeast suggested one at Heathrow and one at Stansted.
I think that the way that the Commission approached it is to say that for climate change reasons, there could only be one net new runway. That was, I think, set in stone at a very early stage of the deliberations. It seems slightly contrary, though, to some of the other research that the Commission did, which was, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean people stop flying. It just means that actually they may take a much more inefficient routing and interline through European or Asian hubs. So we do, we have got ourselves in a muddle, I think.
Steve, it comes back to the point you made. Since the airport companies are private companies, if Gatwick as a private company or the owners of Gatwick as a private company were prepared to build a second runway, shouldn't they be allowed to do so? Well,
absolutely. The whole point of the National Infrastructure Planning process that Nigel explained earlier with the National Policy Statement is that for the first time it does give us the ability to develop projects and get policy support so that we're not facing interminable inquiries as we did with the Terminal 5 inquiry at Heathrow. So yes, that process is designed to allow different projects to come forward and to be assessed on their own merits and within the context of our UK-wide climate change commitments. So
we've had a question.
It's much better to let the market decide.
We've had a question, which is it expected that within the draft aviation NSP that there will be a strategic recognition that Gatwick will be able to apply for the second runway at some point in the future?
I mean, I don't think, that from what I understand and what the Secretary of State's statement said, that the National Policy Statement won't refer to anything at Gatwick. The National Policy Statement is about implementing the decision to permit and allow a third runway at Heathrow. I think that my answer to your question, Regis, about whether or not the government should allow expansion at both, which is something that Heathrow supported from the very beginning of the Airports Commission process, was that, going back to your first question on judicial review and the decision by the government being able to stand up in court, is that the decision by the government is based on the Airports Commission analysis. And the Airports Commission analysis, the first thing they did before they looked at location was, is there the need for an additional runway? And what they found was that there was a need for one new runway in the southeast of England by 2030. And it was based on that decision, they then looked at the various options and then came to their shortlisted conclusion, then their recommendation, which government has now agreed to. If government were now to say that there should be two runways, or there should be a different outcome than the Airports Commission's first conclusion, then the whole decision begins to unravel. So, which I think there is a consensus around, is that the government, having made the decision, now let's get on and do it. One of the ways in which you could best undermine that is by now changing the basis upon which the decision has been changed and leaving the decision more vulnerable to judicial review. So as interesting and useful as it might be to have a hypothetical question about should there be more than one, if you now go for two, you'll end up with none. So let's stick to the decision the government's made, let's implement that, get on with delivering that, and then we can then have the discussion about whether there's need for new runways and where they should go.
Well, we've had an interesting question coming in while we've been discussing this, and that is, how does the government's decision square with the continuing support for the Northern Powerhouse and now the Midlands Engine?
Well, it doesn't.
Well, I think it's totally consistent because actually,
James.
Yeah, because the support that Heathrow Expansion has in the north of England, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales, but particularly in the Northern Powerhouse, the support we have from Liverpool Airport, from Liverpool Chamber of Commerce, from Yorkshire, Labour, Leeds, Bradford Airport, Leeds Chamber of Commerce, the LEP in Leeds, Newcastle Airport, the North East Chamber of Commerce. All of these organisations absolutely see that Heathrow Expansion is vital to the economic strength of the Northern Powerhouse. So a decision for Heathrow is absolutely consistent with a emphasis on the Northern Powerhouse.
James, I'm not sure I really understand that, Regis. I mean, the suggestion is that with a third runway at Heathrow, there'll be more regional flights into Heathrow, creating developing the hub there. But in all realistic realism, an airline will not provide flights into Heathrow on a regional basis because it's too bloody expensive. And even if the charges to Heathrow are kept the same, the real demand will be for long-haul flights and not regional flights. So the Northern Powerhouse still gets disconnected, and the flights from Newcastle will not go to Heathrow. They will go to Dublin or to Amsterdam.
I mean, my response to James's point is that James is very well informed stuff, but I refer him to the Chief Executive of Liverpool Airport, the Chief Executive of Leeds Bradford Airport, the Chief Executive of Newcastle Airport, the Chief Executive of Inverness Airport, the Chief Executive of Belfast City Airport, the Chief Executive of Newquay Airport. They know more than James does, with all due respect, James, about what's in the best interest of their airports and their regions. And they are all very, very supportive of Heathrow Expansion because they know the benefits it will bring to their regions.
But it's also the case that all of these regional airports have relatively high-frequency services to Amsterdam, and presumably some of those services would now go to Heathrow in order to satisfy the needs of the Northern Powerhouse or any other powerhouses.
I think it's at the end of the day, this is about maintaining or improving Britain's connectivity and competitiveness, isn't it? So, I mean, first of all of those regional airports have loads of spare capacity now, and the hope would be that they can drive sufficient demand with new generation aircraft to develop their own point-to-point services. But, the reality is that the hub model it's hard to see how that can go away. So my view would be that rather than just forcing passengers from the regions by default to interline at Schiphol or anywhere else in Europe, to give them a choice that you keep the routes to Amsterdam and so on, but that you also develop feeder services to Heathrow, because obviously the more feeder flights you can get in, the more you can drive demand for long-haul services and build up airline yields and capacity. So I think there is a win-win, but I think, as you rightly say, it comes down to cost. And if it is too expensive, and Heathrow is already, I think, too expensive for these regional services, then it's kind of a zero-sum game.
Final question.
Mike, sorry, I just want to come in on that because it is a really important point as to the fact that Heathrow is and continues to be and builds and becomes more the UK's hub airport. And we've seen a new domestic route come into Heathrow this year from Inverness, which has been incredibly successful. So, I mean, yes, the charges at Heathrow are high, and we are introducing from next year a £10 discount per passenger on regional UK services to help make them more viable. But all of the airports all the UK airports that currently are served by Heathrow, for every single one of them, the routes to Heathrow are their most important routes, and that is why more regional airports want to access Heathrow. And one of the great advantages that Heathrow Expansion is going to bring is to double the number of UK regional airports that can access Heathrow, bringing the whole of the UK, improving its connectivity with the wider world.
Yes, I accept that point, but airports don't operate flights. Airlines operate flights, and it's the economics of operating a flight within the UK with the highest per passenger tax in the world, and into an airport that has very high landing charges, even if you operate at a discount, it does make them less attractive. They make them important for feeder services, but they don't make them attractive for airlines necessarily unless they are feeder services.
Okay, and with that, that's all we have time for today, I'm afraid. Thank you for joining us on the webinar today. We're really excited about seeing all of you again at GAD World in just a few weeks' time, 29th of November through to the 1st of December in Lisbon, where you'll hear more from Heathrow's Director of Strategy, Andrew McMillan, and also from Gatwick CEO Stuart Wingate on their plans for growth and investment. If you've got any feedback on today's webinar or recommendation for future webinars, please do complete our short survey. It will flash up on your screen shortly. Thank you very much. Goodbye.